I gave everything I had to help them stay afloat, only to be erased like I never mattered. For 5 years, I bent my life around their needs, their comfort, their future. And when they finally stood on solid ground, they acted like I had never existed. That kind of betrayal doesn't just cut deep, it reshapes you. But before I take you through how it all fell apart, and what I did next, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more gripping true stories that stay with you long after they're told. It started quietly, as these things often do. After the housing market crash in 2008, my hometown in the Midwest turned into something unrecognizable. Empty storefronts, foreclosure signs on lawns, and people walking around with their shoulders slumped and eyes hollow. I was barely making it myself, having just finalized a messy divorce that drained what little savings I had. But I still had a steady job in civil engineering, a modest apartment, and the kind of stubborn hope that makes you believe you can patch things together if you just try hard enough. My sister, Emily, wasn't so lucky. She and her husband, Mark, had just had their first child, my niece, Lily, when Mark lost his job at the manufacturing plant. Rent was overdue, utilities were getting cut off, and they were talking about moving into a shelter. Emily called me one night in tears. I hadn't heard her cry since we were kids, and our dog got hit by a car. That sound did something to me. I told her not to worry. I'd cover their rent until Mark found work. It wasn't a grand gesture in my mind. It was just family. That's what we do, right? We step in when the people we love are drowning. At first it was temporary, 1 or 2 months just to buy them time, but when 2 months turned into 6 and then a year, I adjusted. I picked up freelance gigs on the side. I stopped eating out, cancelled my gym membership, and gave up plans to move into a better place. Every month I sent the landlord a check and reminded myself that it was worth it because they were getting back on their feet. Emily was grateful, at least in the beginning. She called often, sometimes just to say thank you. Mark, too, seemed genuinely appreciative. He told me over beers one evening, "You're the backbone of this family, man. I don't know where we'd be without you." That made it easier to keep saying yes even when it started to sting. Holidays became more intimate. Since they couldn't travel, I'd bring the festivities to them. Thanksgiving dinner in their cramped apartment. Christmas gifts piled high for Lily, who started calling me Uncle Hero. My own apartment felt colder and emptier each time I returned, but I told myself that love sometimes asks us to choose selflessness over comfort. The months rolled into years. Mark had a few short-term jobs, but nothing stable. Emily picked up babysitting gigs, but they always fell short, so I kept covering rent. And groceries too, when things got tight. I once gave up the deposit on a vacation I'd been planning for years just to pay their electric bill. Looking back, maybe that's where the pattern truly began, me sacrificing, them surviving. I was the safety net they never asked for, but never rejected either. And as time passed, I started to see less of the desperation that had first prompted the call for help. The tears stopped. The panic faded. In its place grew something else, something I couldn't name back then. Still, I held on. I clung to every small expression of thanks, every warm family moment. When Lily turned 3, she ran into my arms with a handmade drawing that said, "I love you, Uncle." It's still on my fridge today, even after everything. I didn't realize it yet, but I had started building my identity around being the one who could fix things. My marriage had failed, my career felt stalled, but here with Emily and Mark I was needed, important, essential. And that belief, being essential, kept me blind to what was slowly changing behind the scenes. By the end of that 5th year, things would look very different. But in the beginning, it felt like love, like purpose, like family. The 2nd year came and went without much change, except for how deeply I was now entwined in their survival. Mark still hadn't found full-time work. He picked up odd jobs, yard work, temp warehouse shifts, but nothing stable. Emily's babysitting hours helped cover diapers and formula for Lily, but it was barely a dent. So I kept writing checks, kept pushing off my own needs, kept telling myself, just a little longer. But a little longer became the silent agreement no one dared define. I was working 12-hour days. My main job as a civil engineer had long been full-time, but now I was also doing evening drafts for a local contractor, and on weekends, I'd help inspect properties for a tiny commission. I drank too much coffee, slept too little, and learned to say no to every little pleasure. No to movies, no to new clothes, no to spontaneous getaways. Every dollar I spent on myself felt like a betrayal to them. They were a young family. They needed more than I did. That was my logic anyway. At first, I didn't feel bitter. In fact, there was a kind of pride in knowing I was helping hold a family together. Not just any family, my sisters. Emily had always been my anchor growing up, defending me against bullies, patching me up when I scraped my knees. Our parents had died young, and she practically raised me. Maybe that's why I felt this unshakable debt to her, even if she never asked for it in those terms. Mark remained respectful. Every once in a while he'd send a text like, "Man, I owe you my life," or "I'll pay you back somehow." He wasn't one for words, but when we'd talk in person, he'd nod slowly and say things like, "You're doing more for Lily than her own dad ever could." I didn't want to be that comparison, but I appreciated the acknowledgement. Still, things started to shift in small ways. They stopped giving me updates. I used to hear from Emily almost daily. Short calls, texts about Lily's first steps, funny stories, pictures. Now, weeks would pass before I'd get a blurry photo or a half-hearted thank you message. I told myself they were just busy. Kids, right? I missed Lily. I missed holding her during her naps, the way she'd babble nonsense and look at me like I was the center of her world. She'd started preschool, and I wasn't even told until after the fact. It stung more than I wanted to admit. Still, I showed up. Every birthday I brought cake, presents, and the same dumb balloon that said "one uncle." At Christmas I spent what I didn't have just to fill their apartment with lights and gifts. My own apartment remained bare, like a forgotten waiting room, but I didn't care, or at least I convinced myself I didn't. Mark began talking about starting his own business, something vague about remodeling and carpentry. Emily floated the idea of going back to school. They had dreams, and I encouraged them. Why wouldn't I? I believed in them more than I ever believed in myself. I had stopped dreaming a long time ago. My world had narrowed into a simple function: keep them afloat. My friends noticed the toll it was taking. "You're not their bank," one of them told me bluntly. "You're their lifeline," said another. "They'll drown you if you don't step back." But I wasn't ready to hear that. I defended them, loudly, emotionally, sometimes angrily. I didn't want to believe I could be taken for granted by the people I loved most. There was one night that still lingers in my mind. I'd just finished a 14-hour day, my shoulders tight from hours hunched over blueprints. I stopped by their place to drop off groceries. Emily opened the door, distracted, and said Mark was out with friends. Lily barely looked up from her tablet. I stood there for a few minutes holding 2 bags of food, feeling like a delivery guy no one tipped. It was the first time I asked myself, would they even notice if I stopped? But I shook the thought away. I couldn't quit on them. Not yet. Not when I'd come this far. I was the glue, the constant, the one who said yes, no matter what. The months blurred together. Rent, groceries, a new car seat, a preschool fundraiser. Emily sent a thank you text once that just read "Uda best," followed by a heart emoji. I stared at it for an hour, wondering why I felt hollow. It wasn't about the money, it was about mattering, about being seen. And without realizing it, I had started disappearing in their story, even as I kept writing the checks that held it all together. It was somewhere in the 4th year when I first felt the ground begin to shift beneath me. Not a landslide, just subtle tremors, easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I had to be. Every month I was budgeting to the cent, watching over their expenses like a silent partner in a life that wasn't mine. Mark had finally landed a decent job, nothing glamorous but steady. He was working full-time at a warehouse for a regional supplier, and they even gave him a small raise within a few months. I heard about it not from him, but from a mutual acquaintance who asked me if I was proud of Mark finally getting his act together. I nodded politely and smiled. Inside, something curdled. I waited for Emily to call and tell me the good news. She didn't. A week passed, then 2. When I asked her about it directly, she said, "Oh yeah, I thought Mark mentioned it." Just like that. Like it wasn't something that should have come from her. With gratitude and maybe a sign that they'd start easing the burden off me, but the rent check still landed squarely on my shoulders. There was no discussion, just assumption. Then came the first real break in our rhythm. They missed Lily's birthday dinner with me. Emily texted an hour before, "So sorry, long day, can we reshed?" No explanation, no follow-up. I spent that night eating cake alone in my kitchen, staring at a wrapped present she'd probably outgrow before I could hand it over. I started noticing other things too. Family photos that included everyone but me. Social media posts from outings they never invited me to. A trip to the zoo. A weekend cabin stay with friends I didn't know they had. None of it was shared except by accident. I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a home I had helped keep standing. Then came the moment that shook me harder than I'd expected. I was out running errands when I saw Mark drive past in a brand new SUV. Not a flashy model, but new, shiny, clean. I stared, confused, half convinced I was mistaken. But later, I checked their driveway and there it was. A vehicle with dealer plates. No one had mentioned a word. I confronted Emily about it, carefully trying not to sound accusatory. "Looks like Mark got a new ride," I said with a half smile. She shrugged. "Yeah, we needed something more reliable for Lily's school runs." I nodded slowly, waiting for her to say more. Maybe an acknowledgement of how tone-deaf it was to buy a new car while I was still paying their rent. But she didn't offer anything, just changed the subject. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind turning circles around the same thought. They don't see me anymore. Not really. The following weeks confirmed it. I'd stopped being included in conversations about their future. When they talked about what we're planning, I was no longer part of the we. My role had shifted from insider to distant benefactor, one who was expected to keep giving, but not expecting a seat at the table. It wasn't just about being left out. It was the slow, quiet realization that my presence had become inconvenient. They didn't want reminders of how they'd made it through the hard years. Maybe it made them feel small. Maybe they were embarrassed. Or maybe they'd simply rewritten the story in their heads. One where they were the heroes who survived. And I was just a footnote. One afternoon, I stopped by unannounced to drop off a birthday gift for Lily. She wasn't home. Emily looked surprised, almost annoyed to see me. Mark stayed in the other room. She took the gift without inviting me in. "I should have called," I mumbled. "Yeah, we've just got a lot going on," she said, not unkindly but distant, like we were acquaintances, not siblings. On the drive home, my chest felt tight, like I'd swallowed something sharp. I couldn't remember the last time they'd thanked me, really thanked me. I couldn't remember the last time they asked how I was doing. I started keeping a journal, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I needed a place to put all the things I couldn't say out loud, things like, "I feel invisible," and "I think they're using me." Writing made it real. Writing made it hurt more. The distance wasn't loud, it didn't scream. It whispered. It took the form of unanswered texts, brief conversations, missed birthdays, and the quiet certainty that I was being replaced by the comfort I had provided. And I stayed quiet even then, because I still believed, maybe foolishly, that things would swing back. That love like this, effort like this, couldn't be forgotten. By the start of the 5th year, I wasn't just tired, I was numb. The kind of numb that creeps in after disappointment no longer shocks you. I had trained myself to expect less, to swallow silence, to act like it didn't matter when I was excluded. But deep down, something was shifting, and it wasn't just resentment, it was clarity. That winter, I finally asked Emily and Mark to sit down with me. I didn't want a fight, I just wanted transparency. "It's been almost 5 years," I said gently. "You both have jobs now. Maybe it's time we talk about easing off some of the financial support." Emily blinked like she didn't understand. Mark looked at his phone the whole time. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "We thought you were okay with how things are. You've never said anything." That hit harder than I expected. I had assumed they knew the strain, how many things I'd given up to keep this going. I had expected, at the very least, a moment of acknowledgement, but all I got was that tone, that distant, disinterested tone that made me feel small. "I've kept things going because I believed it was temporary," I said, struggling to stay calm, "not because I wanted it to be permanent." Mark finally looked up. "So what? You want us to pay you back now?" His words stung. Not because he misunderstood, but because deep down, I think he knew that's not what I wanted. I wanted to matter. I wanted them to care that I was drowning. Emily crossed her arms. "If this is about guilt-tripping us, don't bother. We never forced you." That was the beginning of the unraveling. They didn't start paying rent. Instead, they started dodging me altogether. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts got short replies or were ignored entirely. I began to wonder if asking for a conversation had been the final straw for them, if me finally speaking up made me disposable. Then came the discovery that shattered whatever illusion I had left. I was at the grocery store when I ran into their neighbor, a friendly woman named Carol who had always been chatty. She asked if I'd seen their cute new house yet. I blinked. "House?" "Yeah," she said, cheerful. "They moved out 2 weeks ago, bought a little place just across town. Lily's so excited to have her own room." I barely managed to nod. The rest of her words blurred into static. They had bought a house, moved out, and never told me. I drove past their old apartment later that night. It was empty, the lights off, blinds gone. I sat in my car staring at the dark windows for what felt like hours. Then I drove across town until I found it. A modest bungalow with a white fence and a porch light on. I didn't get out of the car. I just stared, trying to make sense of how they'd left me behind without a word. I called Emily the next morning, no answer. I texted, nothing. I tried again that night. Blocked. That word, blocked, sits in my memory like a stone, cold, final. I showed up at their new house the next weekend, knocked, waited. Mark opened the door, saw me and stepped outside, closing the door behind him like I was a salesman or a stranger. "We need boundaries," he said immediately. "Emily doesn't want to talk." I laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. "You moved. You bought a house. You didn't say a word." Mark didn't flinch. "We needed a fresh start." "With what?" "My money." He shook his head. "We never asked for that. You chose to give." Something broke in me then, not anger, though that would come later, but the last thread of hope that they saw me as anything other than a resource. I stared at him, waiting for something, regret, shame, anything human, but all I got was indifference. I stepped back. "You've erased me. After everything, you've erased me." He didn't reply. Just turned and went back inside. The door shut. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. And just like that, I was out. No farewell from Emily, no chance to say goodbye to Lily. Just silence and a locked phone line. I sat in my car afterward, staring at the dashboard. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't responsible for their rent, but the weight in my chest didn't feel like relief. It felt like grief. The days that followed felt hollow. I moved through them like a machine, checking tasks off a list that no longer mattered. Work, bills, sleep, repeat. But inside, I was a storm. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time. Rage would wake me in the middle of the night, a burning kind that started in my chest and climbed into my throat. I had done everything for them, sacrificed years of my life, and they shut me out like I was a burden they'd finally discarded. Part of me wanted to scream, another part wanted to disappear. I deleted their numbers, erased old texts, but I couldn't stop remembering. The birthdays, the emergencies, the hugs, the quiet thank yous that now felt hollow. I replayed every conversation, searching for clues I'd missed. Had they been planning this all along? Had I misread everything? Or had I simply become inconvenient to the narrative they wanted? I was spiraling, until I remembered the property. It hit me out of nowhere, like a spark in the dark. Our late father's name had remained tied to an old family lot in the county. Years ago, after he passed, the property was inherited jointly by Emily and me. but she had signed over temporary power of attorney to me during a rough patch when she thought she might declare bankruptcy. At the time, she trusted me to manage it, said she didn't want the stress. The document was buried in my filing cabinet, yellowing, barely remembered, but it was still valid. And when I pulled it out, hands trembling, I saw the expiration clause, 10 years. It hadn't lapsed. I stared at it for hours. That plot of land had been worthless for years, just a patch of dirt. But suddenly it meant something again, because I remembered something else. Rumors about zoning changes in that area, rising property values, even talk of commercial developers eyeing the region. Could they have used the deed somehow? The idea seemed paranoid at first, but I couldn't shake it. Emily and Mark had just bought a house. Where had the down payment come from? Their jobs weren't enough. They had no savings, but they had the family name. They had that land. I started digging. Late nights turned into early mornings. I pulled public records, scoured transaction logs, even visited the county registrar's office. The woman behind the desk, bored and chewing gum, printed the records without hesitation. And there it was. They'd leveraged the deed. They'd used it as collateral for their mortgage without ever telling me, without my signature. They had listed the asset as jointly owned, but failed to disclose that I still held power of attorney over it. At first I was stunned. Then something inside me snapped into focus. They had not only used me emotionally, they had used me legally. Counted on my silence, my loyalty, my invisibility. And for the first time I saw the truth. They didn't think I'd fight back. They thought I was too nice. Too passive, too broken. They thought wrong. I called a lawyer the next day, told him everything, every check, every detail, every document I had. He listened quietly, asked a few sharp questions, then said 5 words that reignited something in me. We can freeze the deed. It would be temporary at first, an injunction, a freeze that would halt any refinancing or transfer activity, enough to stop them in their tracks and force a legal review. My lawyer said the case was unusual but strong. That was enough. The decision wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about reclaiming something. I had been a ghost for too long, floating through the corners of other people's lives. It was time to put my feet down. Time to remind them that actions have consequences. Still, I hesitated before signing the papers. I sat in the lawyer's office, pen in hand, heart pounding. Once I signed, there was no going back. This would set things in motion. Complicated, messy, public. But then I thought of Lily. Not in anger, not in guilt, just clarity. She would grow up knowing a version of this story, and I couldn't let that version be that I did nothing. So I signed. As the papers were filed, a strange calm settled over me. Not peace exactly, but purpose. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't reacting. I was acting, taking a step, however small, toward balance, toward truth. And as the freeze went into effect, I didn't feel like the one being erased anymore. Filing the injunction set off a chain reaction I was only partially prepared for. Within 2 days, I received the first email from Emily. The subject line was blank. The body contained a single sentence. "What the hell did you do?" No greeting, no signature, just fury distilled into pixels. I didn't reply. My attorney had advised against direct communication. Everything now had to go through him. I forwarded the email and sat back, my pulse racing, but my mind calm. I had nothing to hide. For the first time, they would have to come to me and not for help. A week passed, then another. My lawyer confirmed the freeze had gone through. The property was now flagged, meaning they couldn't refinance their mortgage, sell the house, or take out any loans tied to that collateral. It wasn't destruction. It was accountability. And it worked. Mark called from a new number. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, voice tense but controlled. "Hey man, look, we need to talk. This is getting serious. Call me back." I didn't. Instead, I let the silence say what I never had. I'm not your safety net anymore. Another email came, this time longer, from Emily. "Why are you doing this? You know we have a kid. You're jeopardizing our entire life. What do you want? Money?" You never asked for anything before, so why now? I trusted you. That line hit me like a slap. I trusted you, as if I hadn't trusted them, as if I hadn't given up years of my life believing they'd never take advantage of that trust. Still, I didn't reply. The mediation request arrived shortly after, legally required now that the injunction had been filed. I sat in the conference room, dressed in the only decent suit I owned, flanked by my lawyer. Emily and Mark arrived together but sat apart. Their lawyer, a fast-talking guy in an expensive jacket, did most of the talking. But I watched their faces. Emily looked tired. Mark looked irritated. Neither looked remorseful. Their lawyer claimed there had been a miscommunication, that my power of attorney had been overlooked, that the use of the property had been inadvertent. But the paperwork told a different story. The signatures, the omission, the calculated choices. My lawyer laid it all out, meticulously, calmly. He wasn't aggressive, he didn't need to be. The facts spoke for themselves. At one point, Mark muttered under his breath, "You're unbelievable." I didn't respond. Emily didn't look at me once. The session ended without resolution. The freeze would remain until they either negotiated a settlement or pursued litigation. They had expected me to fold, I could tell. They'd come thinking I'd be scared or overwhelmed or sentimental. But I wasn't any of those things anymore. Afterward, as we were packing up, Emily finally spoke. "You're destroying us." Her voice wasn't angry. It was bewildered, like she still couldn't grasp that I had drawn a line. I turned to her, meeting her eyes for the first time in months. "I'm just holding you accountable." She shook her head, almost laughing. "You were supposed to be family." I could have said 1,000 things. Could have listed the 5 years of rent, the groceries, the birthdays, the long nights I spent worrying about them more than myself. But I didn't, because if she didn't know by now, she never would. "I was," I said simply, "until you decided I wasn't." That was the last time we spoke in person. The freeze remained. Their lives, which had been built partly on my silence and support, had suddenly hit a wall. And I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel triumphant either. What I felt was solid. For the first time in years, I had made a boundary and stuck to it. Friends started asking questions. Some applauded me, others were wary. Family members called, trying to stay neutral while also urging me to let it go. But I held firm. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing it because if I didn't, I'd vanish completely, from my own story, from my own value. There was one moment I'll never forget. I stood outside my apartment, watching the sunset dip below the buildings. I wasn't rich. I wasn't especially happy. But I was finally free of the weight that had followed me like a shadow. They had built a life by leaning on me, and when they no longer needed me, they kicked away the foundation. But I wasn't going to let them walk across my back one more time. They called it destruction. I called it truth. Word spread faster than I expected. I didn't post anything, didn't explain myself publicly, but in small towns, stories travel on their own. People started to talk, whispers in grocery aisles, hushed questions in church parking lots. Some of them reached out to me directly. Others took sides without ever hearing mine. Aunt Linda called first. Her voice was tight, clearly rehearsed. "Honey, I know you've been through a lot. But freezing the deed, was that really necessary?" I didn't answer her question. I just said, "Ask them why they never told me they moved." She paused. "They said you were overbearing, controlling." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so backwards. I hadn't controlled anything. I'd surrendered everything. The only control I ever took was saying enough. But I could tell she didn't want to hear that. She just wanted things quiet again, neat, forgotten. Other relatives followed suit. Cousins I hadn't seen in years popped into my inbox with messages like, "Hope you're okay, man, but maybe it's time to move on." One even said, "They have a kid, come on." That part stung more than I expected. As if Lily being their daughter erased everything I'd done for her. As if love meant staying silent even when you were being gutted. But not everyone stood against me. Lisa called me the day after the mediation. We hadn't talked in over a year. Life had gotten busy and distance had grown. But she left a voicemail that I must have played 20 times. You were their crutch, and they kicked it out. You deserved better. When we finally met for coffee, it was like no time had passed. She didn't ask for details. She didn't try to fix anything. She just listened. And after months of isolation, that meant everything. She reminded me that I wasn't crazy, that my hurt wasn't selfish, that boundaries weren't betrayal. Lisa had known Emily for years, too. They weren't close anymore, but the history was there. She said something that stuck with me. Some people can only love you when you're broken, because then they feel stronger by comparison. But once you stand up, they panic. It made sense in a way nothing else had. The fallout wasn't just emotional, it was professional too. Mark's job had always been precarious. Word of the property dispute reached his employer, and though they never said it outright, I heard he was passed over for a promotion he'd been expecting. I didn't celebrate that. It didn't bring me any pleasure, but I didn't feel guilty either. For once, the consequences weren't mine to carry. Meanwhile, Emily went quiet. Completely. No emails, no messages, no attempts to mediate or mend. It was as if I had been wiped clean from her memory, and in a way that was its own kind of closure. There was nothing left to hold on to. I started going to therapy. Lisa recommended her old therapist, and I went mostly out of curiosity, but it helped. It gave me words I didn't know I needed. Words like enmeshment, codependence, self-erasure. It was like learning the language of my own pain for the first time. One session, I described what it felt like to walk away from their house after that final confrontation. The therapist nodded and said, "You didn't walk away. You finally stopped bleeding." That image stayed with me. For months I had felt like I'd lost everything, my family, my role, my purpose. But slowly, I began to see that what I lost was a version of myself that was always disappearing for others, and what I gained was the chance to exist on my own terms. People still talk. That's the nature of a small town, but I don't flinch anymore. When someone brings it up with a curious smile or a not-so-subtle jab, I just say, "I did what was right for me." That usually ends the conversation. And when I drive past that little house, the one they bought with the help of the deed I now control, I don't feel rage anymore. I feel distance, the good kind, the kind that lets you breathe. I don't know what will happen next. There's still legal limbo, unanswered questions, and 100 things that might never be resolved. But for now, I'm standing. And that's more than I thought I could say a year ago. I'm not healed, but I'm not hiding either. And maybe that's enough. Moving away wasn't something I planned. It just sort of happened. One morning, I looked around my apartment, the same one I'd lived in for nearly a decade, and realized I didn't recognize the person who had once made it home. The walls felt too close, the memories too loud. Everything in that space had been touched by 5 years of sacrifice, of phone calls and bank transfers and sleepless nights. I needed a clean break, so I took a job in a different city, an offer I'd once turned down because I didn't want to leave Emily and Lily behind. Now there was nothing holding me back. The work was good. The change of scenery, even better. I found myself walking different streets, breathing new air, seeing strangers who didn't know me or my story. It felt like a reset, like possibility. I rented a modest apartment near a park and filled it slowly, this time with things that made me happy. Plants I might actually water. Shelves lined with books I'd been too tired to read. A soft couch I didn't have to apologize for. For once, my life didn't orbit anyone else's gravity. I woke up and chose what I wanted to do, and no one's disappointment loomed over those choices. Therapy became a lifeline. I kept going weekly, sometimes twice when the emotions felt heavier. I was learning to recognize patterns, not just in my relationship with Emily and Mark, but in so many other places. How I always said yes. How I equated love with sacrifice. How I taught people that I was only valuable when I was useful. My therapist once asked, what would it look like to matter without suffering for it? I didn't have an answer then, but I carried that question with me everywhere. Meanwhile, Lisa and I grew closer. What started as supportive check-ins turned into shared dinners, late-night conversations, spontaneous weekend hikes. She never pushed. never asked more than I could give. Her presence was steady, her laughter light in a way I'd forgotten existed. She reminded me how good it felt to be known, not needed, not depended on, but truly seen. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, music we loved, childhood memories, bad dates, good books, and sometimes when the mood was quieter, she'd just say, "You didn't deserve any of that." And I'd believe her a little more each time. There were still moments when the past tugged at me. Random triggers, a song Lily once sang, a scent from Emily's kitchen, a voicemail I couldn't bring myself to delete. But the pain no longer felt like a trap. It was a scar, not an open wound. One afternoon, while walking through a quiet bookstore, I found a children's book I'd once gifted Lily. I stood there holding it, unsure whether to smile or cry. Instead, I bought it, took it home, placed it on a shelf, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. I loved deeply. That wasn't a failure. Letting go wasn't about pretending it didn't hurt. It was about accepting that I couldn't force people to value what I gave. I had to find that value within myself. I started setting boundaries in other areas of my life. I stopped replying to guilt-tripping relatives. I said no to unreasonable requests at work. I took vacations without needing a justification. Slowly, I began rewriting the script I'd lived by for so long. Helping wasn't a problem. Losing myself in the process was. As time passed, the idea of reaching out to Emily faded. Not from bitterness, but from clarity. Some people are chapters in your life. Some are entire books. And some are closed volumes you've already read too many times, hoping the ending will change. And I no longer needed to rewrite hers. Peace didn't come in a grand epiphany. It came in small, ordinary moments. Drinking coffee alone and not feeling lonely. Watching a storm roll in and not wishing I had someone to explain it to. Waking up and realizing I wasn't bracing for impact. It was in those quiet, steady days that I began to understand. I was allowed to take up space in my own life. And that might be the most radical thing I've ever done. It had been nearly 9 months since I filed the injunction when I received her letter. A real letter, not an email, not a voicemail, handwritten, not a... 3 pages folded neatly in a plain envelope with my name and new address in shaky cursive. My first instinct was to throw it away. But I didn't. I sat down, opened it, and read. It wasn't an apology. Emily didn't say she was sorry. She didn't ask how I was. The letter was direct, transactional. She explained how the frozen deed had complicated their mortgage, how their lender was threatening penalties, how they couldn't refinance, how it was hurting Lily's stability. And then came the question, would I please lift the freeze? I read it 3 times, waiting for something else, a word, a sentence, anything to show she understood. But it wasn't there. She wanted me to undo the consequences, but not once did she acknowledge the betrayal that caused them. I didn't respond immediately. I let the letter sit on my desk for a week untouched. I thought about what it had cost me, not just financially, but emotionally. The hours, the years, the quiet unraveling of my identity. And I thought about what it would mean to let it go, to give her what she wanted without hearing what I needed. So I wrote back. It wasn't long, just enough to say what I hadn't before, that I didn't do this to punish her, that I had spent half a decade giving everything without asking for anything in return, that she had made choices, and those choices had consequences. I ended with this. You taught me what love without respect looks like. I won't repeat the lesson. And I mailed it. A month passed in silence. Then I heard through Lisa that Mark had filed for bankruptcy. His employer had downsized. They'd fallen behind on bills. The house was at risk. None of it surprised me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't gloat. But I didn't break either. This wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to vanish again. I kept the freeze in place, not out of spite, but out of principle. The legal process gave me the standing I'd never had emotionally, and I used it, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. My lawyer checked in regularly, updating me on procedural steps, reminding me of my rights. He offered to pursue further action, financial restitution, even damages for misuse of authority, but I declined. I didn't want more battles. I wanted space. I wanted silence. I wanted closure. Friends still asked if I'd ever speak to them again. I didn't know how to answer. Sometimes I missed Lily so much it ached. I wondered what she was told, whether she thought I disappeared, whether she remembered the bedtime stories, the pancakes, the way she used to call me Uncle Hero. But I also knew that reaching out could pull me back into a version of myself I no longer wanted to inhabit. The fixer, the ghost, the open door. So I stayed still. Lisa stood by me through all of it. One evening, over dinner, she asked gently, "If they ever did apologize, really apologize, would you forgive them?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "Forgiveness isn't the hard part. Trust is." She nodded. "That's fair." Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about letting them off the hook. It was about letting go of the weight I'd carried. And slowly, quietly, I had already started to do that. Every day I woke up without anxiety was a kind of healing. Every time I chose myself without guilt, it was an act of defiance. Not against them, but against the belief that love should always come at my expense. One night, I drove past a stretch of empty land on the edge of my new town, undeveloped, untouched. It reminded me of that family lot, the one they tried to bury me with, except this one had no history, no betrayal, just possibility. I sat there a while thinking about how something that seems empty can still hold value, how even scorched earth can grow again. I didn't know if Emily and Mark would recover. I didn't know if I'd ever hear from Lily, but I did know one thing. I was no longer waiting for them to validate my worth. I had reclaimed it myself. It's been 2 years since I froze the deed, since I stepped out of their lives and back into my own. I don't think they ever truly expected me to walk away. Maybe they thought I'd cave, like I always had. But I didn't, and I haven't looked back. Life now is quieter, slower, but not empty. I wake up in the mornings and don't brace for drama. I make breakfast, read in silence, take long walks without checking my phone for emergencies. I've learned to enjoy stillness, the absence of need. There's something sacred in being allowed to just be. The apartment I moved into became a home. Not overnight. But with time, it grew into a space that reflects who I am, not who I used to be. There are photos on the walls, mostly of places I've been lately, people I've chosen to keep close. Lisa's in many of them. She's become a constant, not through obligation or crisis, but choice. Our connection is built on honesty, not need. She sees me even when I have nothing to give. The people who stayed in my life, those who respected the lines I drew, have become my new family. Not by blood, but by presence. They don't expect me to break for them. They don't disappear when I don't show up with offerings. They listen, they ask, they care. I still think about Lily sometimes. I probably always will. She was too young to understand what happened, and maybe that's a blessing. She didn't choose any of this, but I chose to stop breaking myself for a family that only saw my value in what I could provide. That choice didn't come easy, but it was necessary. I've come to realize something. There's no medal for martyrdom, no prize for self-erasure. For years I thought love was measured by how much you were willing to sacrifice. Now I know love without mutual respect is just servitude in disguise, and healing isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It sneaks in on quiet days when you notice your breath has slowed, your shoulders aren't tight, your smile isn't forced. It shows up when you no longer rehearse imaginary arguments or crave words you'll never hear. People have asked if I regret it, freezing the deed, walking away, not offering them one last lifeline. And to that, I say this: I don't regret drawing a line. I regret how long it took me to believe I was allowed to. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Your worth isn't defined by how much you give or how long you endure. Boundaries aren't selfish, they're survival. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, enough. We don't owe people the destruction of ourselves in the name of loyalty, especially when that loyalty is one-sided. So if this story moved you, even a little, hit that subscribe button. It means more than you know. These stories, our stories, they matter. Because they remind us we're not alone in the messy, painful, beautiful act of reclaiming ourselves. And if you're still here, don't leave just yet. There's another story waiting, one of betrayal, of justice, of someone who found power in the middle of heartbreak. Click the next video on the screen, you won't believe what happened next.